politics and particularly populism. We sort of set the stage last class to have first of all a kind of primer on how the Mexican political system evolved in the 20th century, specifically after the revolution, and starting with the period of those sort of 2 decades, 1920 to 1940, roughly, of sort of post-revolutionary reconstruction, a new state, a new political system, and then we went over what sort of happened subsequently with the consolidation of a party-state system, right? Corporatism. We talked about corporatism and its sort of main characteristics, and also how that system essentially, sort of withered away, right? It was not a sudden collapse, but it was actually a sort of a progressive transformation and a move of the political system in the direction of a sort of competitive party system, right? With a series of, with a sort of a separation, right? If we think about the fact that the old party system or the old political system was a party-state system, then the new system evolved in a way in which sort of party and state separated, right? In the last, starting in the very last few years of the 20th century, and certainly in the first couple of decades of the 21st century, right? And so sort of capping that process was once again the election of Vicente Fox as president of Mexico. Before that, the election, just 3 years before that, the election of Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, the son of Lázaro Cárdenas, as mayor of Mexico City, right? First election, if I remember correctly, I think that's accurate, of a mayor in Mexico City, right? No longer an appointed position, right? At the discretion of the president, but something who was voted into that position. There have been other reforms. We don't really have a lot of time to talk about the details, but now basically that position of mayor in Mexico City is called, jefe or jefa, right, depending on the gender, de gobierno, which is kind of equivalent to being a governor, right? And now the old sort of districts of that compose the larger federal district, right, Mexico City, are actually sort of mayorships or alcaldías, right? And all of those positions are actually elected position, people who are elected, by popular vote. Now, what I want to do today is talk a little bit more about what has happened in the last couple of decades, and also to put the election of López Obrador, or AMLO, right, by his initials, as president of Mexico in 2018. The first thing to know, I did mention this last class, is that the sort of six administrations starting in 1982 until 2018, 6 administrations in Mexico actually supported the neoliberal agenda or Washington Consensus, right, before the election of López Obrador. Now, this is, of course, I identified 1982. Remember, it's also the year of a big crisis in Mexico. The sort of, one can think of this as, if you want to use sort of a year to establish a kind of before and after. This is the end of import substitution and industrialization, the beginning of the the transformation of the Mexican economy and its move towards, making it an export-oriented economy, right? Adopting the principles of the Washington Consensus, the sort of recipes of the International Monetary Fund, austerity, privatization, sort of thinning of the state, all these things that we have already talked about. So, Mexico was actually a pretty good sort of student, right, or a follower, right, of neoliberalism. That's what I mean, of neoliberalism, of the Washington Consensus, with some things that need to be sort of observed in terms of footnotes, if you will, right? One of the things that is tricky when we talk about neoliberalism is that, we use a term to apply to many different realities, right? A few sessions back, I talked about how, in Chile, early in the 1970s after the coup, the military junta applied neoliberalism ruthlessly, right? But really, when you look at different national cases, you see varieties of neoliberalism, right? Not everything is the same. So the same principle or the same idea applies to Mexico, right? Mexico privatized a bunch of industries, right? Steel, telecommunications, all sorts of things, right, that we have talked about. But it did not privatize oil production, right? Oil extraction remained and refinement remained in the hands of the state. It did not privatize the electricity, the utility, right? There's a national electrical utility that remains to this day in the hands of the state. There have been some adjustments that have allowed for the growing participation of the private sector, almost all of which were actually reversed by López Obrador starting in 2018. We'll get to that in a moment. Now, at the same time that this is happening in Mexico, right? These governments, including the government of Vicente Fox in 2000, following and continuing with the principles, let's say, right, the charter of the Washington Consensus. Something else is happening in Latin America, right? A very interesting transformation, which is what has been called the pink tide, or turn to the left, in Latin America during the sort of very late 20th century and early 21st centuries, right, or century. And this pink tide was sort of known for its rejection of neoliberalism, right? And this sort of pink tide, the term refers to governments, right, in throughout Latin America, in major countries in Latin America, that were sort of elected in leaders who were, who rose to power, essentially, on a platform of rejecting neoliberalism. Okay, and we have, lots of countries in Latin America: Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Uruguay and Chile. There's a little bit of a question mark about whether those can be put in there. But all these countries, right, starting in around sort of in 98, 99, all these countries sort of moved to the left, to a kind of sort of populist social democratic left. All of these, leaders that rose to power were, elected through, free elections, right? But often those presidential tickets were actually led by these sort of very charismatic populist leaders, right? So not so much sort of technocrats, right? But actually populist leaders. All of these leaders, this is, kind of like common characteristics, right, to the leadership of these sort of pink tide. These leaders emphasized sort of social justice, right? De-emphasized, and we can say even, sort of at least implicitly renounced armed struggle, right? So these in some cases these were leaders who had been part of guerrilla movements and insurgency movements, or sort of clandestine political movements during the years of military dictatorships in Latin America. Think about the case of Lula in Brazil. Actually, the president of Uruguay had been in jail because he was part of a guerrilla movement in Uruguay. The same goes for Michelle Bachelet, who was president of Chile, and so forth and so on. But essentially, these leaders come to power renouncing armed struggle. They use liberal democratic means to become presidents. What do I mean by that? Elections, right? Sort of free and fair elections, let's say. All of them were very vocal, again, against neoliberalism, which meant opposing, and in some cases, partly reversing privatization, but really did not make any radical moves to abolish private property, right? So they favored South-to-South economic exchanges, right? For a moment there in the early years, in the first decade of the 21st century, Venezuela led the efforts to constitute a kind of political economic alliance between or among these governments, favoring kind of a sort of regional integration between sort of kindred leaders and governments during this period, and all of them made sort of a series of moves to strengthen the role of the state in the economy as well as in society, right? And when I say or when I speak about society, I'm referring to, for example, the development of cash transfer programs, right? Direct aid to a variety of constituencies or populations within society, right? Like money for the elderly, money for students, for the urban poor, for small farmers, etc., right? Depending the constituency. This is actually a very interesting moment because this is in part possible by another development that is happening in the global economy, right? How can you sort of launch a kind of strong program that sort of strengthens South-to-South exchanges and cooperation, et cetera, right? Where's the money coming from? Where are the resources coming from? Well, in the early 2000s, there is actually a kind of economic boom in the global economy that increases the price of commodities, right? What am I talking about? The price of oil, right? Number one. And the price and particularly demand for agricultural products, in particular soybeans, right? And this is actually very interesting, right? Because it funnels, or it gives, right? Produces a lot of money for countries like Venezuela, right? Venezuela has been for a number of decades and sort of oil producing economy and an oil dependent economy, right? You guys know that, and so it's very interesting because oil prices increase substantially, dramatically, I would say, and that of course brings a lot of money to the Venezuelan government, right? So much so that it's actually flush with cash. And it can, the president of Venezuela, right, Hugo Chavez, we'll see his picture in a moment, can actually establish or lead these kind of petro diplomacy, right, in South America and beyond South America, actually, kind of like around the world, right? So he goes, offering loans and money to Argentina, but he also goes to Africa and, meets with African leaders who are facing whatever, economic, distressful economic situation, and he has sort of, cash in hand, to help and kind of, get these leaders and countries on board with this kind of like South to South sort of solidarity, right? Another interesting example, of course, is, it has to do with soybeans, right? Who or what country is fueling the demand for soybeans in the sort of early decades of our century? Say it out loud.
China.
China, of course, right? China is, growing tremendously, right? Through the roof, right? Incredible GDP rates. And China is becoming, or has become at this point, the kind of factory of the world, right? And it needs food to feed its workers, right? Where is that food coming from? Well, it's actually coming in part from, not just, but in part from South America, right? So countries like Brazil and Argentina that are leading producers of soybeans actually benefit from this demand coming from China, from Asia, and so this demand is also bringing a lot of hard currency, right? This is paid in dollars, so a lot of hard currency to these governments, right? That's a very interesting moment in the global economy, and another example of how these sort of national economies, but also political movements are in various ways sort of interconnected, right? Talk about globalization, right? It's demand for food coming from Asia that actually gives cash or, gives a lot of resources to these, pink-tide governments, right? And then there's the example of oil that I already talked about. So here you have some of the leaders, right? Some of the most important leaders of these sort of pink tide in Latin America. Okay, this is when we go to our famous, already well-established game, or who is who, right? Who is who? Extra points. Come on. So who's this guy? The president of? Of course, that the presidential sash is giving it away, so only half point for you. So, I'm kidding. What's his name, or was his name? So this is, or was, he passed away, Nestor Kirchner, right, president of Argentina, and a follower and a leader of the old Peronista, kind of like left-wing Peronista movement, right? We talk about Perón, Juan Domingo Perón in Argentina last class, right? So he's one of the sort of heirs who's claiming the mantle of Peronism in sort of 21st century, early 21st century Argentina. Who's this guy? That's easy, right? Hugo Chavez, the president of Venezuela, right? He led a coup attempt in Venezuela in the 1990s. He was a member of the military, and he was jailed for some months because of that. He was given amnesty by a Venezuelan president, and later on he actually won a presidential election, became president of Venezuela. And so I was talking about how Hugo Chavez, right, was going around Latin America and the world basically, right, flush with petrocash, with petrodollars, right, saying, hey, let's get on board with this agenda of South to South cooperation and solidarity. I remember actually, now it's a little bit slightly vague, but slightly blurry, but this can be checked very easily, actually, just going online. But I remember at some point, Hugo Chavez is touring Africa and countries in Africa, and he goes, if I remember correctly, to Mali. And Mali was facing a very dire situation because the entire rice crop had gotten contaminated with a kind of fungus, right? And so had all the rice that they were producing, that is a fundamental staple for the Malian people, for the people of Mali, had gotten spoiled, right? And so very interesting because we can speculate a little bit here, without necessarily deviating tons from the potential scenario. Or whether the actual situation. So the Hugo Chavez and the president of Mali meet, and the president of Mali sort of presents sort of the situation. And what does Hugo Chavez? What does he do? He didn't offer technology to avoid, or scientific support to avoid a similar situation sort of next year, or to figure out what happened to the to that particular crop of rice that year. He actually offered to buy the entire, spoiled production of rice, right? That meant really just giving the money equivalent to the value of that of the production of rice of Mali that year. There was so much money, right, in the Venezuelan economy that he had sort of, if you will, the luxury, right, of just buying. Whatever tonnage of rice, spoiled rice, the Malian government had in its warehouses, and say, here's the money, right? Of course, that stuff needed to be just like burned or just destroyed somehow. Another not unimportant footnote, that much cash, right, into your economy as a result of a mono export, a single export, right, oil, can have terrible consequences, and has had terrible consequences for the Venezuelan economy. One of the obvious one is that it makes your economy hyper dependent on the price of a single commodity, right? And this is what we have been talking about now for weeks, about how things like import substitution industrialization was a program to try to reverse the dependence of global economies in the global South on the value, right, and the trading of one or a couple of commodities, right, that were fluctuating radically in price. So one day you have a lot of money, next day you have nothing, right, or very little, because the barrel of oil went from $100 to 10, say. Even if you slash that by half, it's terrible for your economy. The other thing, the second terrible consequence for your economy is that it produces inflation, right? It's bound to produce inflation because the price of a thing that you're putting into the global market, keeps increasing, right? But nothing in your global economy has changed, right? The price of labor is the same. The price of food staples is basically the same, et cetera, right? You have so much oil that you can also subsidize consumption of gas, fuel, et cetera, in the local economy. But all of that money comes back, right, and starts circulating in the economy, and it produces inflation. That's actually something that has happened, for centuries in the global economy. There are many cases going back all the way to, if I remember correctly, the 1500s or 1600s. So much so that it has a name that's called the Amsterdam disease, right? It's something that where your economy is doing so well globally, right, that you're bringing a lot of money, a lot of resources back in, but that produces actually inflation. When nothing else has changed in your economy that would lead to rise in prices of your products, right? And that's exactly what happened subsequently in Venezuela, right? Tremendous inflation. All right, going back to our list of leaders here. Who's the third guy there? Yes, don't be shy. Say it.
I Googled it, though, so it's cheating. But, Luis Inácio Lula da Silva.
Yes, Lula, the president of Brazil, right? A labor activist, right? A unionist who was persecuted, jailed as a young man, leader of union movement in Brazil. He served 2 terms, was followed by president of his own party, but that president was actually deposed by Congress, right? Dilma Rousseff. And then the story continues in a moment because actually Lula was actually jailed, and after leaving jail, after being exonerated, actually he won the presidency again. So he's the current president of Brazil, winning actually by a very, very small margin this time. And who's this guy? This is Evo Morales, former president of Bolivia, right? An indigenous leader of an indigenous movement in Bolivia that rose to power, became president. He served several terms, and he was actually deposed by coup. Had to flee the country, etc., etc. Now, these are kind of like the phases, right, of the pink tide, particularly in the sort of first 10, 15 years or so, roughly speaking, of the 21st century. What's his name? I was going to say Cesar Chavez. Hugo Chavez died of cancer, unfortunately, and so he was sort of replaced by a kind of political heir. I know you. I'm sure you know about this. Nicolás Maduro, who has not enjoyed the popularity, doesn't have the charisma, let's say, of Hugo Chavez, but also has faced very different economic circumstances and political circumstances for his country, right? Nicolás Maduro has had to deal with, the inflation, a lot of political polarization in his country, and growing antagonism vis-a-vis the U.S. Now, why am I telling all this story, all these details about the pink tide? Well, because Mexico was not part of the pink tide in Latin America, right? Whereas you had, these governments against sort of neoliberalism, Mexico actually was not on board. Mexico continued to sort of elect, in a new political system, right, where there was, actual, competition, between parties. Leaders and representatives of political parties that were generally on board with the sort of neoliberal agenda. And in the meantime, while all of this is sort of happening in the rest of Latin America, Mexico keeps deepening its economic integration with the United States through the North American Free Trade Agreement. Okay? Any questions? Anyway, any questions so far about any of this stuff? The term pink tide, by the way, was sort of generally applied to this sort of political moment in Latin America, but actually it actually comes originally, if I remember correctly, from Europe, with a variety of governments, particularly in Mediterranean Europe, actually turning to the left. At some point in the 90s, a little bit before in some cases. I'm talking about countries like Spain, like Portugal, like Greece, etc., etc. France, of course. So that's kind of like the original pink tide, right? Turn to the left, but not the revolutionary communist, socialist, radical left of yesteryear, right? But actually a more sort of social democratic left, which was on board with the market economy, with sort of free elections, electoral competition, and so forth and so on. Any questions about this? Yes?
What do you think about some political scientists talking about like the second big tide?
We're going to get to that.
Oh, okay.
But thank you for asking that. Yes, exactly. There is a kind of new pink tide, and that's where kind of like maybe Mexico fits into that new pink tide. Right? Other questions? No other questions? All right. Excellent. Let's move on. So, yeah, as sort of Natalia was asking, there is a kind of new pink tide, right, in Latin America, and you know, some scholars, political scientists, political sociologists, observers, analysts, etc., have, you know, see the election of AMLO, of López Obrador, President López Obrador in Mexico, as part of this new pink tide in Latin America, right? So this new pink tide includes Mexico, of course, then Argentina, until very recently, right? Because things have changed politically in Argentina. Nestor Kirchner passed away, but his wife, widow, Cristina Kirchner, was elected president, right? There was a moment when another government came into place, more on board with a kind of neoliberal agenda. That government was ended, and a new president that was more pink tide-ish was elected. He finished his term, and now there's a president in Argentina who I think we could probably characterize as neoliberal, right? Last name Milei. I'm sure you have heard about him. A former television commentator or something like that. At the same time, Lula is back, right? Lula is president. There is a sort of leftist president, Nicolás Maduro, in Venezuela, but you know, it's sort of largely or highly discredited in certain circles. The Venezuelan economy has been in a major crisis for a good number of years now, you know, and that has produced, as everybody in this room I'm sure knows, a huge outmigration from Venezuela and very significant impoverishment of the Venezuelan population. Right, Venezuela was a rich country until very recently. Now it's a country that is in very serious economic turmoil. Peru elected also a kind of populist leftist leader. He was deposed by the Peruvian Congress. And then we have a very sort of discredited authoritarian leader in Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, who was part of the old Sandinista revolution back in the late 70s. And now he sort of clings to power with increasingly repressive measures and increasingly also isolated in the Latin American and kind of like global stage. Now, so it's a new pink tide, but as you can see from my comments, my very general comments, it's a pink tide. It's a new pink tide that is kind of treading water, right? It's like it doesn't have the kind of economic favorable circumstances, right, that the old pink tide had. Not that long ago, right? Just a few years ago. And in many of these countries, you have kind of like a leftist populist leader elected and followed by the right-wing populist president and so forth and so on, right? So the electorates are sort of restless. right, in many of these countries, wherever there are more or less free elections, because that's not the case necessarily in Venezuela. There's definitely not the case in Nicaragua, and so on. So, going back to our main guest of honor today, AMLO, right? López Obrador. He wins the presidential election in for a multi-party system, not a two-party system, multi-party system, a landslide, right? 53% would not be that surprising in the U.S., but because we have a two-party system here. But in a system where you have 3, 4, 5 parties, competing, right? Obtaining 53% of the vote is huge. His agenda, as we kind of like already intimated last class, is an anti-neoliberal, anti-corruption, and anti-socioeconomic inequality or anti-inequality agenda, right? It's actually very interesting because, as I mentioned also last class, he won on his third run for the presidency, right? He first ran in 2006, then in 2012, and finally winning in 2018. He presents himself as a kind of anti-systemic outsider, right? But in fact, AMLO is a product of the Mexican political system, right? Very much a product of the political system, starting with the fact that he was a member of the old PRI, right? Before becoming president in 2018, from 2000 to 2006, he was actually the mayor of Mexico City, right? So, his election, though, is, as I said also last class, a kind of cataclysmic movement for the Mexican political system. First of all, because it broke, right? It sort of interrupted this sort of series of governments that were on board with the kind of sort of neoliberal agenda, the Washington Consensus, et cetera, right? But also, if you set that sort of more economic agenda to the side, right? You put the economic program to the side. His election was, very a sort of an earthquake, right, for the Mexican political system because of how he, steamrolled over, rolled over all political parties, but also because he did so by slowly creating a kind of party political movement called Movimiento de Regeneración Nacional, or Movement for National Regeneration. I guess that would be the literal translation, not very good translation. And known by its sort of initials, or actually more like the first syllable, right, of each word, Morena, right? That's AMLO's party. And Morena, as a sort of party movement, has grown in part by absorbing politicians and political forces from all the other parties. First of all, Morena was built on the back of the leftist party that was used by Cárdenas to win the mayorship of Mexico City, right, back in 1997. Cárdenas tried repeatedly to become president. He was not elected, right? But AMLO actually used that party to kind of like launch his movement. Once that party seemed to have exhausted its possibilities, AMLO abandoned that party and created a new political party, which is this one, right? And essentially he had a kind of open door policy, if you will, or practice to kind of inviting, absorbing other, politicians, even when those politicians were actually or had been highly discredited in previous administrations, right? Or were part of previous administrations and, had been accused of corruption or something like that. To the extent that they supported him, to the extent that they supported his sort of agenda with these, say, 3 points, they were welcome into the party. And then there are some. So there's people from the right, there's people from the left, there's people from the old PRI. He was part of the old PRI. And then there's some satellite parties that also kind of like support him. And they support him in part because that's a way for those parties to obtain votes and to remain registered parties, right? Official existing parties in the Mexican political system. Now, what is going on with Morena? We mentioned last class that AMLO is about to finish his term, right, in a matter of a few months. But what is interesting is that one of his most important legacies, right, perhaps, I think so, is that it's actually, or in a relatively short time, is turning Morena into the new hegemonic party of the Mexican political system. Right? These days, Morena not only has the presidency, but it also has Mexico City. It governs Mexico City, right? Which is huge, right? Because of the number of, the population, the size of Mexico City, right? And it has now about 20 or 21 governorships in the country. That's actually huge. So basically, right, it's like saying like 2/3 of the states in Mexico are actually governed by this party. And this party is a party that was just created a few years ago, right? So a hegemonic party like the PRI, like the old PRI, but not exactly like the PRI. Among other, for a variety of reasons. One of them, I think, that's sort of my sense. This is kind of like analysis as we go, right? Because this is today. Morena is not exactly reconstituting a kind of corporatist system, right? So there is no this effort to once again sort of organize Mexican society in these sort of big organizations representing large collectivities, right? The workers, the peasants, the middle class, it's the students, etc., right? So it's in some ways similar, but it's not exactly the same. It's, in terms of the transformations of Mexican society, of course, it's a very different moment, right? Mexican society is much more sort of heterogeneous, right? It has, of course, changed a lot in the sort of intervening 100 years since the old corporatism was launched, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So there are different circumstances, right? That kind of helps us make sense or explain why. Yes, like the old, like the old PRI, but not exactly like the old PRI. Now I ask you to read about 3 pieces for today, right? And all of those pieces, I think, one of them kind of like recounted, there was a very short one that recounted sort of AMLO's sort of rise to power. That was kind of like the easiest to read. It was just a kind of sort of, chronology of his, sort of rise to the presidency. There was another one that deals with the issue of corruption in Mexico and assesses the AMLO presidency up to the first kind of like year and a half, both in terms of sort of corruption and the kind of populist style of government. And then there was another piece which is, it's not necessarily the longest, but I would say it's kind of like the more sort of dense, because it's a little bit more sort of theoretical. It's actually the introduction to a special issue of a journal on populism, right? But I chose that piece because it has some interesting material that we can use to make sense of what's going on in Mexico, connected to the world, right? Which is our goal here. And so that just kind of like giving you a little bit more background as to why we're reading those materials. One of the authors, or actually, it's actually three authors in that piece, actually, I believe it's the piece on corruption, called AMLO, called López Obrador, a textbook populist, right? And the authors argue because he promised to serve and represent the people, quote unquote, with whom he has built an unprecedented link, right? So, part of our task, of course, is to kind of talk a little bit more and make sense of this sort of style of political leadership, style of government, populism, and some of its consequences, right? So the piece that is the introduction to a special issue of a journal, the one that is not the longest, but the kind of like the densest, I would say, theoretically speaking, has an interesting definition of populism, right? The authors write, populism is a distinct reaction to the social dislocations of globalization, a response to the frustration with the nature of political representation and participation, and the emergence of new kinds of social marginalization, precarious existence, and disenchantment, right? This is kind of a definition of populism, right? And it's a definition, but also a kind of explanation as to why, populism on the right as well as on the left is kind of sweeping the world, by the way. Okay? Now, let's unpack this definition characterization a little bit, right? Distinctive reaction to the social dislocations of globalization. What are these guys talking about? What are the dislocations of globalization? Right? What can we think of as sort of dislocations, social, economic, other kinds of dislocations produced by globalization? Who can give me an example of dislocations produced by globalization? What would be an example or two of dislocations? Yes?
One would be Driscoll's and like multinational corporations coming into San Quentin and replacing the local growers.
We associate globalizations with this, program of economic liberalization, open markets, and with transnational corporations, powerful transnational corporations from the global north, penetrating the economies, the local economies of the global south, displacing, right, some of the local producers, right, small farmers, etc., absorbing or vertically integrating some of them, right, but putting out of business a bunch of other ones, right. So that would be an example. Thank you. That's actually on point, very much so. Yes. What other dislocations, social, economic? We can think of more, right? Cultural, religious dislocations that we associate with globalization.
I was thinking of like the land of some indigenous communities, and just I guess what we've learning in class, Mexico got into debt because it was adopting a very neoliberal agenda. So I guess the money that Mexico couldn't invest in society because of the debt could be a way. I don't know.
Absolutely, right? Like these shrinking states, right, that are in debt, that need to pay, instead of using the taxes that they collect for improving the conditions of the population, they're serving their huge, mammoth loans, right, that keep those economies afloat, right? Of course, that creates a series of, problems, right? Poverty, There's one that, of course, we can think of as associated with globalization, and particularly with the kinds of things that you guys I just remarked, which is what? What happened to those farmers that are put out of business by this, opening of and liberalization of markets and national economies? What happens to those farmers?
They go broke.
And what happens when you go broke? What do? Do you starve, or you can be on the move, right? Migration, right? Migration is something that we associate with globalization, right? The only thing is that while the strawberries that Driscoll's produce in San Quintin, in Baja, benefit from a free trade agreement, right? So we can have them at Ralph's over here in Westwood, nice and shiny, right? People don't have that benefit, right? So those displaced farmers, right, or the employees of those farmers, right, that lost their jobs when the farm closed, don't, they just don't have a free pass, right, through the border, right, to where the jobs are, right, or a better standard of living is, right. So migration, right, economic dislocations like the ones that you guys mentioned. What else? Other examples of sort of dislocations and these sort of... Yes, Mark?
Maybe big companies in the United States relocating to Mexico?
That's excellent. Thank you for mentioning that, right? Actually, all this process that has been going on for a few decades now, right, of companies from the global north, right, going to where the cheap labor is, right? So that's Mexico, but also China, Bangladesh these days, Vietnam, Indonesia, you name it, right? Kind of like all over in the global south, right? But in recent decades, of course, a lot of it going to China, and the jobs in the global north, right, evaporating, right, disappearing, right. Now, what happens to those jobs? Well, we know what happens to the jobs, right? They move overseas. What happens to the workers? What happens to the workers? What happens to the right classic GM worker in Detroit whose job just moved to China? What happens to that worker? You guys can speculate. You don't have to. What happens to the worker, right? Anybody? Does he starve and just say, "Oh, too bad"? Just, wither away. That's the way. No, right? They might mobilize. There's so many things we can say about that hypothetical worker. That hypothetical worker will become a worker at a Subway, right? And will join the growing service economy, right? That offers actually very little in the form of a social wage, right? Probably that job will not come with insurance, will not come with a pension, any kind of sort of retirement scheme, right? Minimal benefits, right? And the wages are going to be a fraction of what he or she used to make, building cars, right, in Detroit, right? All of those are dislocations, right? We can talk also about cultural dislocations, et cetera, right? Think about the entire gig economy, right? That is so huge and pervasive nowadays, right? A combination of technology and all sort of new forms of, management of the labor force, new forms of, precarization, right? Those workers who drive for Uber or deliver, right, lunches and burgers to people, they are considered not employees, right? They are associates or, freelance entrepreneurs, right, who use their own cars. So these workers have to, share their profits with the company, right? Whatever the cost of the ride is to the airport, right? And on top of that, they also have to keep their car in good condition, so they have to save from the whatever is left for them, so they can actually keep the car running and shiny, because there are inspections by the company to make sure that that car is sort of clean and more or less in good condition, et cetera, right? And so, right? That's another, kind of like phenomenon, right? That is very much with us. And if you think about this sort of gig economy, it's extending to the entire world, right? There are gig workers everywhere now, right? They're all part of this sort of large service economy that is very much characterized by the lack of any kind of employment security, right? One day you're employed, if you crash, that's your problem, man, right? There's no job tomorrow unless you're going to start walking, delivering those sandwiches. And so, anyway, so good. Does this make sense then? Is that more or less clear with those examples? Why sort of, how scholars, right, political scientists, political sociologists connect the rise of populism or populist governments and populist leadership to these sort of dislocations, right? Now, yes?
Just to get a sense of kind of like the Mexican elections, what are like the prominent issues for these upcoming elections with presidential candidates?
That's a great question. I'll answer it like super quickly because of time constraints. But basically what is at stake is a kind of sort of continuation of the AMLO agenda, right? The candidate that I told you about last class, right? Claudia Sheinbaum, it's basically the candidate of Morena, the candidate of López Obrador, and she's what's on the agenda, right? It's basically a kind of continuity of the current. And AMLO has been such a powerful and dominant figure in the Mexican political system, which is, I guess, what I've been trying to say, that the opposition, particularly the opposition coalesced around the traditional political parties, are basically the one item, if you will, that I would say brings together their agenda is we're anti-AMLO, right? So it's not that they're in favor of corruption, but they're in favor of some of the things that kind of have become to be characteristic of the AMLO presidency, of which I'm supposed to talk about next. So that's why I said very brief answer to. But does that that's a very sort of, hopefully what comes next will help answer some of that question mark. Okay. So all right. So we're here now. Populism is not just the leadership, right? Populism is effective mobilization, right? For populists to come to power, they actually have to mobilize the populace, right? They have to convince the electorate, right? Unless they come to power via coup or something like that, right? Or as a result of the magic touch of the fairy godmother, which doesn't happen. So, these populist movements and populist leaders actually, use different things, different sort of tools to effectively mobilize the electorate, right, in their favor, right? Sometimes it's some kind of national sentiment, some kind of ethnic solidarity, right? Religious solidarity. We didn't talk too much about religion, but religion is also a very powerful mobilizer, right? And sometimes the kind of discontent that people experience in relation to globalization or globalizing forces in the world have to do often with, or get kind of like channeled through religious sentiments, right? There, if you have noticed, populism is on the rise, right, or has been on the rise for some time in the world, right? There's a kind of resurgence of populist politics. So there's populism on the right and there's populism on the left, right? Some people say, well, the right-wing populism, it tends to be kind of exclusive, right? Excludes certain people, right? The classic case is, as I will show next, is a lot of populist movements around the world, identify migrants or immigrants, a kind of sort of us versus them type of thing, right? In a way of sort of mobilizing a particular segment of the electorate who sees, or which sees itself as sort of, a kind of victim of globalization, including the arrival of large numbers of immigrants, right? What is very common in all these different forms of populism, it's this last point. A kind of sort of separation between the people, right, and what populist leaders very often identify, whether, regardless of whether it's a populist leader on the right or the left, that they identify as corrupt elites, right? What's the term that Donald Trump uses for that? Donald Trump is a populist leader, by the way, in case you haven't noticed. So what's the term that he used to refer to the corrupt elites?
I think he uses the term the swamp.
The swamp, right? The swamp is where these nebulous, yucky, realm, where all these sort of corrupt politicians, and it's purposefully nebulous, right? That's exactly the point, because as far as a concept, it is useless, right? Because, I can say that my dear Andrew here, if he's my political enemy, he's part of the swamp, right? What did he do? Andrew's like, what? I'm not. I'm a grad student. Come on, I have no money. I was in your position some years ago, Andrew, so yeah. But yeah, you see my point, right? It's not a category of analysis like we use in, say, sociology or the social sciences. It's what we call a kind of category of political practice. But the same goes for the term the people. Who are the people? What does that mean? Anybody? Yes?
I would probably guess the electorate at large.
Why don't you say the electorate then? Why don't these leaders say the electorate? The electorate, of course, is a much more, defined, well, it's the people who register to vote and come out and vote, right? That's the electorate, right? But the people actually invokes, once again, a broader, much sort of, on the one hand, potentially encompassing, group of people, but also potentially containing exclusionary elements, right? Because you can say, if I'm going to go back to Andrew, and I can say, Andrew really is not part of the people, right? He's not part of the people, He has a beard, and that makes him suspect, The people doesn't wear beard, I'm joking here. I'm just using funny stuff here, right, to entertain all of you. But to make the point, right, it's the characteristics are kind of, once again, right, just like the swamp, the people is sort of nebulous and can be used to say, no, Andrew is part of the people, right, as much as it can be used to exclude Andrew from that broad category, right, on the basis of politics, right? So this is very interesting, right? Because all these populist leaders, right, whether on the right or the left, invoke the people, right, as a just ultimate justification for their political agenda, their style of politics, their aims, etc., right? Right? We are doing it for the people, right? And it's actually very interesting because, as we will see momentarily, these politicians also claim to have a direct connection with the people, right? I talk to the people directly. The people, when I say this, and that, the people understand what I'm saying. They know what I'm talking about. Just as when I'm talking about the swamp, right? They'll know what the swamp means or is. And so, once again, come back to our game of who's who on the screen. Everybody knows that, I hope. Is that the case? Did you just say Lord Voldemort, Mark? No, you didn't. No, that was just... No. President Trump. President Trump, former President Trump. But that's the easy one.
Is that Merkel?
No, it's not. Merkel is not a populist leader, right? It's much more of a traditional, leader in the style of sort of liberal democratic politics. Was the former Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, right? Or Angela, as the Germans would say. Who's this lady?
Oh, she's Australian?
No, it's not
Oh,
Australian.
yeah, never mind.
She's not Australian, she's from France. I was going to say a French fry, but that's a little bit disrespectful. She's from France. She is Marine Le Pen, right? Marine Le Pen, a famous right-wing leader, right, in France. The daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, who's so almost a historic leader of the populist right in France. Viktor Orban from Hungary, right? This is a tricky one. Don't Google it. Nigel Farage, the leader of British leader of the political party that led the Brexit effort, taking Britain out of the European Union. And who's this guy? Bolsonaro, the Voldemort of South America. I'm kidding. I don't know if there are any Bolsonaristas here, so should be more careful. Jair Bolsonaro, former president of Brazil, in a lot of legal trouble recently because he appears to have led an attempt to depose or to block Lula's return to power, right? Once he was elected, right? So he's kind of a little bit, not exactly, but a little bit on the, hiding under a rock or something like that. So what do these guys have in common?
They're all populists.
Populists of what sort or what kind?
Conservative?
Conservative right-wing populists, right? Almost all of them, maybe this does not include so much Bolsonaro, have something else in common. They are anti-globalist, right, I would say, right? Maybe that includes Bolsonaro as well. But certainly these four on the left side are anti-globalist, and their populist discourse is strongly anti-immigrant, right? That's the case of Trump, as you well know. That's the case of Marine Le Pen. That's the case of Orban, and that's the case of Farage as well. Because one of the sort of premises, right? One of the reasons to get out of the European Union for the sort of pro-Brexit coalition was we're getting flooded with immigrants, right? And we need to have kind of like control of our borders, right? Which is also very similar to what Trump says, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what about AMLO? AMLO is not a right-wing populist, you know. He is more of that sort of kind of like pinkish type of the sort of left-wing populist, right? Once again, right, compared to the old left that advocated or considered the possibility of armed struggle as a way to achieve power, AMLO, you know, was elected president. He was elected with a sort of multi-class support. So it's sort of a multi-class movement that was behind him as he rose to power and became president of Mexico in 2018. He has implemented an incredible communication strategy of daily press conferences, unheard of, right? Every morning from 7 to 9 a.m. roughly, Monday through Friday, he has a press conference that is, you know, covered by every newspaper, televised by multiple channels in the Mexican media, and also streamed via YouTube and other platforms, right? Where he speaks directly to the people, right? Once again, it's very interesting and very important in terms of the communication strategies. And it's interesting, he doesn't do the press conference at 5 p.m. or 7 p.m. in the evening, right? He does that, or 12 noon. He conducts his press conference at 7 a.m., you know, rain or shine. Why? Why? Why is that part of the communication strategy? Why is that so important? See?
So it's the first thing they hear.
Again?
So it's like the first thing that they hear.
The first thing anybody hears in Mexico, right, comes from AMLO's mouth. He dominates the news cycle. That's what he wants to do, right? He dominates, and he's similar to Donald Trump, because Donald Trump, while he did not do the press conferences, he was posting on X, or formerly known as Twitter, every day, and you woke up, certainly on the West Coast, to something that Mr. Trump had said about somebody or something, you know, complain about how the world is unfair to him, etc., you know, early in the day, right? You guys probably remember. Now, the other thing that has been characteristic of his administration, and this goes to answering a little bit of your question, Mark, is, you know, and this is sort of what has AMLO done in terms of a program, right? Well, he has been a central piece of his government and of his administration have been these cash transfer programs to help the poor, to help the elderly, you know, students, a variety of stakeholders, right? And you know, the opposition, I think, rightly so, complains that this is actually a clientelism, right? Because often the people who register folks in these different cash transfer programs are actually wearing vests with the color of his political party, sometimes bearing the name of the president, etc., etc. So instead of an institution, you know, or the appearance is that an institution is giving you the money, it's actually a person, right? It's a person, it's the president. It's the leader who's, you know, the benevolent leader who cares for your well-being and who's giving you the money, right, to survive. He's also, as I mentioned last class, invested in large infrastructure programs, particularly in the south of Mexico, precisely because of that big regional inequality that persists in Mexico, between northern Mexico, with a lot of the foreign direct investment has been going to, and the south. And a key characteristic and element, this is actually super, super important, where AMLO shares with many other leaders, right or left, or right and left, is that he has been very diligent at rebuilding presidentialism in Mexico, reconcentrating power, policy, and decision-making power in the figure of the president in Mexico, right? Okay, I'm going to pause here. I'm gonna dedicate maybe 5 minutes next session to the rest of these, and then we're going to move to migration, which is the next couple of weeks. So please, the readings are on Canvas. Read, read, and read.
So now we decide.